Ladies and gentlemen, my name is iRunShibb. I'm happy to have you here today. Today's video is going to be discussing my leveling Necromancer build in Diablo 4 Season 2. This build relies heavily around minions and shadow damage over time. It keeps you super tanky, and it doesn't require nearly any legendaries at all. It relies heavily on minions and shadow damage. It's a ton of fun to use, and it feels truly like a Necromancer. I went through the World Tier 3 capstone solo at level 36. Let's dive right into it. Get torched, you trash man. The DOT be ticking for sure. So before we dive into everything, I want to quickly show that I'm level 46 now. I'm using minions, as you can see. I've been doing a whole lot of Tree of Whispers stuff, especially as soon as I got into World Tier 3, doing those dungeons for the Tree of Whispers. These dungeons right here that give you 5 Tree of Whispers points, and also a chance of going after a dungeon is super strong, especially as soon as you get into World Tier 3. I have been really liking these blood harvests because you do get Tree of Whispers stuff as well while you're doing the harvest. And you also get the stuff that you need for the blood packs for the vampires, but we'll talk about that stuff later in the video. First, let's dive right into the abilities of this build. So let's dive right into it. This build is focused very much around shadow damage and minions, and we're actually not going to be using any of the first 2 sets of abilities. We're not using basic or core abilities at all. So you need 2 points in your basic, and then you need a certain amount of points in core. But what I end up doing is just putting all the points in Hued Flesh, which I think is a super strong aspect. It just allows you to generate corpses on any source of damage. You're going to want Blood Mist for your button, but other than that, use Corpse Explosion for your main source of damage with Corpse Miasma. I ended up juicing this thing up and getting a pair of pants that gets 2 more points onto Corpse Explosion. You're going to want to buff up your warriors. You're going to want to put points in Fueled by Death. I found 2 more points on my necklace, which is amazing. This is going to make it so every time you utilize a corpse, you get 15% increased damage, which is insanely strong. I put points in Skeletal Mage Mastery, and I am going to end up putting points in Death's Embrace because I am going to stay in the fray a ton with Blood Mist. One thing I want to note quickly is that I do sometimes use Decrepify when Corpse Tendrils doesn't have any use. For example, in those capstones, Corpse Tendril is not going to move any of those bosses. So instead, I put points in Decrepify to keep my cooldowns indefinitely up by going into Abhorrent Decrepify here, which makes it so that you reduce your cooldowns very frequently while using your abilities. That's a good trade out. But when you're mobbing or going through dungeons, I think Corpse Tendrils is more impactful than Decrepify for this specific leveling build. You want to put points into Necrotic Carapace, making so you fortify every time a corpse is dropped, and then you put points into the various shadow damage boosts. Then last but not least, we are going to want to put points in Army of the Dead. When I get to my end of my builds, for the most part, a lot of the time I head down towards Bone Storm, especially when I get the shadow damage over time on Bone Storm if I'm building a shadow build. But for this minion leveling, doing things that are 15 levels, 10 levels higher than me, it's really important to have Army of the Dead, because Army of the Dead allows you to respawn all your minions in a flash. And during those large capstone type encounters, when you have Decrepify, you'll constantly have Army of the Dead up ready to go. You want to buff up your Golem. You want to have your Golem increased health and damage. It does insane damage now with the buff. And then you want to increase all the points here. You heal your minions with Skeletal Priests. You have increased armor and resistances on all your minions. They gain attack speed, and last but not least, they deal 30% increased damage. This stuff is super strong right now for leveling, but obviously as I'm tailoring endgame builds, a lot of this stuff will change, but we'll talk about that in another video. And then I choose Shadow Blight because Shadow Blight, just constant Corpse Miasma, this is going to be the best source of damage. The attack speed that you get from this is really just not that useful. So I truly do believe Shadow Blight is the way to go. In terms of Book of the Dead, you're going to absolutely need Reapers, especially with them dropping a corpse. That helps you in every aspect, gives you corpses to utilize, and since they're generating corpses, it's going to generate Fortify for you. It's just super important. I could see potentially with a new Thorns style build going Defenders and really trying to play off of that. Thorns deal 150 to 300% increased damage. That has some potential. I could see a build potentially going that way, but I never really loved Thorns builds. I don't like playing around builds that require me to take damage in order for me to deal damage. And although there's potential with it, especially with all the tankiness of the minions now, I just haven't built it yet. But for now, we're going to keep it the way I think is best, which is the forming a corpse with Reapers, Skeletal Mages. Right now I have Cold. I bounce back and forth between Shadow with stun percentage and Cold. I liked Cold during the capstone just to make sure that the boss was constantly being CC'd. It's super impactful, but you can bounce between the 2 of those. Shadow is also going to help with a lot of your passives. So it's typically the way to go until you get stuck on a boss. Like I said, I entered World Tier 3 at 36, so I needed to have some sort of CC to keep me alive. And then the best golem ever, the Bone Golem. Bone Golem, having him be able to taunt all the time, especially as you're leveling, is so important. Keeping all the focus on this golem. That'll also shed corpses as he takes damage, while being able to taunt everyone every certain amount of seconds. And when Decrepify's up, he's got taunt almost indefinitely, keeping all the attention off you. It's such a good aspect of this build and so necessary as you're chasing higher level stuff. So now let's talk about some of the vampiric powers that I truly do think is super impactful on this new set. One of which being you deal 30% increased damage over time effects to enemies who are affected by vampiric curse, which synergizes unbelievably well with the fact that your companions and your minions have a 30% chance to inflict vampiric curse. So these two back are almost an absolute must, and they'll deal more damage to crowd control enemies. So when you use your corpse tendrils, they will be doing more damage as well. I also like the increased damage to the vulnerable enemies because of corpse tendrils and vulnerable enemies affected by and enemies are vulnerable while affected by vampiric curses, so that just makes you do more damage in general. This could be a strong one for the damage over time builds. I'm not 100% sold on it yet for this specific build, but I think it could be strong maybe with the shadow damage over time build later on. It makes it so enemies who get hit with direct damage get inflicted with pox, and when that gets applied 8 times, they take poison damage. So it's just more of that DOT, just constant damage sources all the time. It doesn't play maybe later on. For some of the ones I don't have selected just yet, I'll walk through some of my favorites. Obviously, my vampiric powers, most of them aren't even activated. I just switched up all my gear. I'll have to assign and make sure that my packs are correct to get this stuff working. But I like the idea of this. You deal 40% of your maximum damage as physical damage, or of your maximum life as physical damage. I like this one that does you deal 40% of your maximum life as physical damage to nearby enemies, and this can happen every 4 seconds. It also heals you when it happens. That has some potential. I also really like, there's a 22% chance to inflict vampiric curse on enemies. Afflicted enemies have a 15% chance to spread it to other enemies. And the vampiric curse's stored souls deal 100% increased damage. And one thing I want to talk about quickly is, as you see in the bottom of this, it says, when unaliving an enemy affected by vampiric curse, it stores their soul. Casting a defensive, macabre, or agility skill will unleash the souls stored on nearby enemies. This is awesome. So, for example, when you use your blood mist after you've ended a bunch of enemies that have curses on them, say 8 of them, it just launches 8 souls at an enemy. It's so strong, it's so bursty, it's so fun to use. I think it's really cool. So this will actually make that do more damage, and it'll give you another lucky hit chance, which ultimately allows you to apply vampiric curse. I think this is a really good one as well. I like Metamorphosis a lot. When you evade, you become a cloud of bats and unstoppable, and you deal physical damage along the path and applying vampiric curse as you dodge through enemies. I think it's really strong. It's not 100% necessary, but I think it is good. This one is super strong, I think, for a minion build or a stationary damage over time build, where you, after 3 seconds of not moving, you gain a barrier equal to 20% of your maximum life for 6 seconds, and it can happen every 20 seconds. A strong defensive aspect, absolutely. The idea of Feed the Coven is okay because there's a chance, because it can increase your damage by 10% for 4 seconds, which is really, really strong, and it's something I'm going to play with in the end game. But my problem with it is, in this specific build, you don't actually use any of your resource at all. So there's really no need for the 10 primary resource gain from your minions. I just don't. Half of the usage of this not being utilized at all, it makes it less effective, I think, on the build, but it has potential. In terms of some of the gear and stuff I have on that I think you should look for, I don't have anything min-max in terms of legendaries yet, and I don't think you really should be thinking about that while leveling, so I'll bring it up for the sake of conversation. But the reason this build is so strong is it really doesn't require very many legendaries to use, and that's why it's so good at leveling. It keeps you super tanky, keeps your minions tanky in the forefront, so you're able to do all this content that's a much higher level than you to help you get to the next world tier and so on. But some of the important things are minion reduction in damage. Blood mist leaves shadow damage over time, and it also makes it so you don't have a movement speed reduction. That's just mostly for the movement speed reduction for right now. Increasing the amount of warriors and mages that you have, damage while standing still, and minion damage, stuff like that is super impactful. I recently just got a lot of this stuff on, so that's why a lot of it's lining up, but I just put it on before the video. The whole time I was leveling, I did not have it set up like this. So that's going to do it for the video today. If you like this kind of content, hitting the subscribe button down below, coming over to the Twitch and hitting the follow button, all that stuff is super impactful and helpful to me. I'm loving season 2 so far, and I can't wait to make more end game and leveling builds for you guys. I will see you guys very soon. My birthday is the day before the Game Awards. It would have been so nice to have both at the same time, just in case something cool pops up. torched, you trash man. The DOT be ticking for sure.